Welcome back to our read-through of Plato's Theaetetus. I thought I would get this up much earlier, but certain real-life exigencies contrived to prevent this, so my apologies for that. Now, we left off at 151d, where Theaetetus offers the first substantial definition of knowledge, which we labelled D1. Quote, "It seems to me that one who knows something is perceiving the thing he knows, and, so far as I can see at present, knowledge is nothing but perception." End quote. As we are getting into the meat of the dialogue, and we are now being presented with the first serious attempt at a definition, I need to make some linguistic comments on the key terms that Plato is using here. The whole tone of Theaetetus' response here is tentative and couched in the language of seeming, which is in accord with the substance of the definition itself. Two words that appear in this, which I want to focus on for the moment, are aesthesis and the verb doctrine. One can hear our word aesthetic in aesthesis, from which it is derived. However, unlike our word aesthetic, which denotes judgments about beauty and taste, particularly in art, and aesthetics, which becomes a subdiscipline in philosophy in the course of the 18th century, the Greek word aesthesis denotes awareness or perception. The origin of this word is in the auditory sense, but comes to denote in ordinary Greek the way in which we become aware. In an important article on perception in Plato, Michael Freda cautions us against straightforwardly translating it as sense perception in all occurrences, because it was Plato who canonized this technical sense of the word for philosophical discourse precisely through dialogues like the Theaetetus. Prior to Plato, and outside of philosophical discourse generally, it could, as Freda says, quote, "be used in any case in which one perceives something by the senses, and even more generally, in any case in which one becomes aware of something, notices something, realizes, or even comes to understand something, however this may come about." End quote. Some occurrences do not even involve awareness, for instance, plants which respond to stimuli, an example actually used in the Theaetetus at 167c, where Socrates is talking about how the horticulturalist will be able to instill good and healthy aesthesis in plants, or another example from the great physician Hippocrates, who describes the heart as aisthenontai malista, meaning something like feeling emotions most poignantly. The other word to note here is the verb dokein, which means to expect, to seem, and to be reputed. The word doxa is derived from this verb and is the standard term for belief or opinion. Here in D1, it appears in Theaetetus' doke moi, "it seems to me," a very common Greek expression used when reporting an impression or an opinion. It also figures in the second attempted definition, D2, knowledge is true belief, he alethes doxa episteme einai, which appears later at 187ab, and the verb doxazein, which gives us to believe, opine, or judge. Plato tends to use it in these ways interchangeably. Doxa also means reputation, as in the way in which one is perceived publicly, that is, in the way one appears to others. In Latin, the word gloria translates doxa in this reputational sense. For both the ancient Greeks and the Romans, the achievement of reputation was a conventional aspiration, especially for anyone seeking greatness, even those seeking a form of virtual immortality where one's name and deeds will live on long after one's death. An earlier Greek word for this was kleos, meaning rumour, report, or fame. It is kleos in the latter sense, which determines one of the themes of Homer's Iliad, which is glory-seeking, notably in the character of Achilles. From all these interrelated senses, we get cognitive states that are derived from or dependent in some way on how things appear or seem to one. But as the popular saying goes, the way things appear are not necessarily how things really are, and a great reputation sometimes conceals a rogue. On purely linguistic grounds, aesthesis means becoming aware or even responding to stimulus, as we saw with the plants example, and doxa expresses appearances and cognitions derived therefrom, namely opinion or belief. Through Plato, aesthesis will become the standard philosophical term for sense perception. There is another word of interest that appears in Theaetetus' statement with which we began, when he says, "So far as I can see at present, kai hosce nuni phainotai," the verb phaino, which means to show, make appear, display, manifest, and so on. It is where the word phenomenon derives, and which gives us the English phenomenon, something that appears or shows itself. The language throughout this passage is that of appearing, manifesting, showing, seeming, and this conforms to the spirit of D1, that knowledge is, as it were, becoming aware of or perceiving that which shows itself. As it stands, and in the light of these linguistic considerations alone, D1 defines knowledge as awareness, and as such is rather vague and uninformative. Something else is required, and Socrates provides that immediately. Quote, "If I may venture to say so, this is not a bad description of knowledge that you have given, but one which Protagoras also used to give, only he has said the same thing in a different way. For he says somewhere that man is the measure of all things, of the existence of the things that are, and the non-existence of the things that are not." End quote. Socrates introduces the well-known man-measure doctrine of Protagoras of Abdera, the renowned sophist, and claims that it expresses D1, but just in different words. Socrates proposes that D1 and MM, or man-measure, are identical. Knowledge is perception, is the same as saying that man, in the sense anthropos, the human, is the measure of all things, of the existence of the things that are, and the non-existence of the things that are not. There has been considerable discussion since antiquity and to this day amongst scholars as to how precisely to understand Protagoras here. We won't delve too deeply into this now, but I'll mention three possible readings. Let's call them the phenomenalist reading, which will be the interpretation of Plato and others. Second, what I'll call here the anthropological reading. And lastly, what I will term the phenomenological reading. Turning to the anthropological reading first, it could be that the species man, anthropos, is limited to cognitions of the appearances of things only, and that cognition of how things really are is simply beyond our natural powers. This can allow for agreement or alignment amongst people of cognitions. For example, I indicate to you that red car over there and start to list off various properties that the car appears to possess. We both of us perceive these properties as they appear as confirmed in our ability to discuss these properties relatively uncontroversially. For instance, the car is red, four-wheeled, two-doored, diesel-powered, and so on. On this reading, Protagoras could simply be making some kind of claim about the limitations of humans as a species in their ability to cognize anything more than just how things appear to a normally endowed human being. In sum, we, as a species, are therefore limited only to the appearances of things. How things really are, in and of themselves, is forever beyond our ability, and this is a natural special limitation. Something like that, anyway. The phenomenological reading, as I'm calling it, takes its cue from the word Protagoras uses, and which is translated as things, as in the measure of all things. The word he uses there is krema, or kremata in the plural. It can mean a thing that one needs, or a thing that one uses. It's also the word for money. Broadly speaking, krema denotes things insofar as we have dealings with them. With this in mind, let's rephrase the man-measure saying like this. Man is the measure of all those things with which he has dealings insofar as he has dealings with them, that they are such or that they are not. However, we still have the same ambiguity about man here. Does this mean that each individual is the measure, or is this a judgment about the species? The phenomenological reading certainly has the advantage of saving Protagoras from the stronger reading, which takes kremata to mean beings as such, as opposed to merely things as we have dealings with them. Taken together with what we know about Protagoras' general relativism across all domains, it would be fair to say that he denies that we can ever know about things as they are in and for themselves. The phenomenalist reading seems best able to make sense of Protagoras' global relativism, for all our doings with the world are ultimately mediated through experience. All our doings with the world depend on our sensible apprehension of the world and its contents, and points towards Plato's reading, whereby the man-measure doctrine is identified with Theaetetus' first definition, D1, that knowledge is nothing other than perception. If so, then the identification of MM with D1 seems to be the most plausible one. The question as to whether MM entails D1 is and has been much disputed, and is an issue that I will set aside for the moment. This identification is also how Aristotle understood MM, as did the much later skeptic Sextus Empiricus, who was writing sometime in the mid-2nd century AD. I'll quote from Sextus. He says, "Protagoras has it that human beings are a measure of all things, of those that they are, and of those that are not that they are not. By measure he means the standard, and by things, objects. So he is implicitly saying that human beings are the standard for all objects, of those that they are, and of those that are not that they are not. For this reason he posits only what is apparent to each person, and thus introduces relativity." Note this last sentence, he posits only what is apparent to each person, and thus introduces relativity. That is, the MM doctrine here is being read as individualist, and in line with the way that both Plato and Aristotle take it. So, summary at this stage, Theaetetus offers a first definition, D1, knowledge is nothing but perception. Socrates immediately asserts that this is identical to the Protagorean man-measure doctrine. This is certainly a plausible, perhaps the most plausible interpretation of the Protagorean doctrine, especially as it fits well with his relativistic teachings across all other domains. But does D1 entail the man-measure doctrine? In other words, is there a necessary logical connection between D1 and man-measure? This is a weighty question, and one which we should leave aside until we come on to the refutation of D1, which will begin at 160. Meanwhile, Socrates goes on to illustrate what is at stake here with the wind example. So, there is a wind blowing, and John reports it as cold, but Mary reports the very same wind as warm. One and the same wind is both warm and cold. The wind appears cold to John, is the same as John perceives the wind to be cold. Socrates assimilates perception, aesthesis, to appearance, phantasia. How things appear to someone is how they are. As perception is always of that which exists, and as perception is knowledge, it cannot be false. The wind in itself is neither hot nor cold. Moreover, there is no wind in itself, but only perceptions of wind and its coldness or warmth, and so on. This is because, as Socrates says at 152c, quote, "As each person perceives things, such they are to each person." Therefore, he continues, perception is always of that which exists, and since it is knowledge, according to D1, it cannot be false. This last, that knowledge cannot be false, is crucial for everything that follows. We'll call this the infallibility condition. To put it another way, where it is possible for there to be falsehood, there cannot be knowledge. If it is possible that I may be mistaken in my cognition about X, then I do not have knowledge of X. This sets knowledge apart from any and all other cognitive states. If knowledge is perception, then perception must be infallible. However, according to man-measure here, false cognitions are impossible, because everything is as it is perceived. That is, there is no wind as such, or a warm wind or a cold wind. There is only the perception of the wind and its relative warmth or coldness, which will differ from person to person, even if only slightly. So one of the aims of the Socratic elenchus here will be to show that false cognitions are possible. And if falsehood is possible, then that kind of cognition, which allows for the possibility of falsehood, must be ruled out as a candidate for knowledge. Now, perception is certainly incorrigible, but is it infallible? Let me explain. Incorrigibility here means that some cognitive state cannot be shown to be false. However, it doesn't follow that therefore it is true. For example, if I view a distant tower which I perceive to be round, then at that moment it appears round. I really am perceiving the roundness of the tower. My current perception of its roundness is then said to be incorrigible. However, am I then justified in concluding that the tower really is round? Well, no, because as I move closer to the tower, I now perceive that it appears to be square, yet my initial perception at time 1 was of roundness, and that perception has now been replaced by the perception of squareness at time 2. What about the situation where I have seen the tower up close on some prior occasion, and I am aware that it is square and not round? That's to say, I have a true belief that it is a square tower and not a round tower. Even still, at T1, my perception is still of its roundness, even though I am now aware that this is only an optical illusion. So my belief that the tower is square happens to be true, yet my perception at T1 is still of its roundness. In this case, my belief in its squareness and my T1 perception of its roundness are at variance, and my explanation for this variance rests on it being an optical illusion. So even though my belief in the squareness of the tower is true, my perception at T1 is of its roundness. And this is what we mean by the incorrigibility of perception. We must guard against confusing incorrigibility with infallibility. Perceptions are incorrigible, but it doesn't follow that they are infallible, as my tower example demonstrates. Moving on from the wind example, Socrates then imputes to Protagoras what he calls a secret doctrine. That is, he claims that Protagoras is really a follower of Heraclitus, an earlier pre-Socratic thinker, to whom is attributed the claim that all is in flux, interpreted as meaning that everything is in motion, or different kinds of motion. Nothing is static, nothing is stable. He interprets this as follows, quote, that nothing is one and invariable, and you could not rightly ascribe any quality whatsoever to anything, end quote. The implications of which are that, quote, if you call it large, it will also appear to be small, and light if you call it heavy, and everything else in the same way, since nothing whatever is one, either a particular thing or of a particular quality, but it is out of movement and motion and mixture with one another that all those things become, which we wrongly say are, wrongly, because nothing ever is, but is always becoming, end quote. He says that all the poets and the philosophers hitherto, with the sole exception of Parmenides, subscribe to this doctrine that all is in a state of becoming. He provides proof for the plausibility of this doctrine that appeals to the phenomenon of change, out of which new life emerges, or, for example, fire, which emerges from movement and friction, and a few others. Change here, or kinesis, motion as he terms it here, therefore is the cause of the existence of things. He then further illustrates the rather serious implications that this generates, namely that, quote, nothing is one and invariable, and you could not rightly ascribe any quality whatsoever to anything, at 153d following. He takes the example of the colour white. We cannot say it is something external to our eyes, nor can we say that it's something inside our eyes, because to do so would be to ascribe a definite and stable place to it, and this would be incompatible with the flux doctrine, where everything is always in motion. Rather, colour, or the perception of colour, is something that emerges as a result of this motion or this process, and would be peculiar to each individual. Moreover, not only will this perception differ from individual to individual, but even to each individual, for they are also in flux. Each individual is differing from his or herself from moment to moment, because, recall, all is in flux, so nothing is stable, and therefore there is no stable entity or standard by which anything could be described and compared as larger, hot, white, or more or less. Whether this is a fair representation of Heraclitus's teaching is neither here nor there, because we are simply assessing the basic and simple claim that all is in flux and the implications of that claim. As Mary Margaret McCabe puts it in her 1994 book, Plato's Individuals, quote, "This is lethal to the individuation of objects, for they turn out to be bundles of perceptual episodes with nothing to tie them together. It's equally lethal to the individuation of persons. No one is somebody since every episode is new. There are then only stages, not persons for the stages to constitute. Individuals fall apart." End quote. Protagoras is also committed to the claim that nothing can change without increasing or decreasing, but Socrates uses the simple example of the dice to refute this. Let there be 6 dice, and if we compare 4 with them, we can say that they are more than 4 by half. So half of 4 is 2, plus 4 equals 6. But when we compare them with 12 dice, we see that 6 is less by half. That's to say, half of 12 is 6. And this is impossible to deny. The constant throughout is the 6 dice, and all that changes here is its relation to other quantities of dice. The young mathematician Theaetetus agrees, but says that the flux doctrine demands that he denies it, and yet he finds that this is impossible. At this point, we see that undeniable mathematical truths pose a very serious challenge to the flux doctrine. On the face of it, the claim that all is in flux cannot stand, because mathematical truths are not nothing, and they are not in flux. The basic claim, all is in flux, would have to be conditioned in some way. Perhaps one could condition it in the following way: everything except mathematical truths are in flux. Commentators are divided on this point, that is to say, the status of the Heraclitus Flux doctrine for Plato. On the one hand, for the Unitarians, Plato is only concerned to refute the global claim that all is in flux, and he rather seeks to limit it solely to the physical world. That Plato holds that the flux doctrine is only true for the physical world, but not for non-physical things. He seeks it to limit it solely to the physical world. But according to the Unitarians, in the Theaetetus, Plato is setting out to refute the flux doctrine in its entirety, and not just to limit it to the physical, as the Unitarians would argue. So now, a final summary. The first definition of knowledge, D1, is that it is perception. Socrates then claims that D1 is identical to Protagoras' man-measure doctrine, which in turn entails the flux doctrine of Heraclitus. Much of the material between 151 and 160 is expository in nature. Socrates aims here to clarify what D1 means and to expand on the claim that anyone who proposes that knowledge is perception is committed to Protagorean relativism and to the Heraclitean flux doctrine. What follows, all the way to 187, with the exception of the digression, is taken up with refuting D1. We'll take it up again from 154e, and I hope to have that, part 3, uploaded very shortly. This then will conclude the expository section of the analysis of D1 up to 160, whence the discussion will turn to its refutation. But for now, please like and subscribe, and once again, thank you for your attention.